Hello and welcome to this, the latest of our Broadcast Revolution events and the first of 2026. And I'm thrilled that our focus today is the launch of this. It's our brand new Broadcast Revolution annual report entitled The Many Waves of Broadcasting. This report is, I believe, the most comprehensive and insightful document that Broadcast Revolution has ever produced. I think it proves that serious strategy is required and considerable creative to secure the impact that you really crave. And that broadcast coverage can have such an impact. You can read in this report, you can hear over the next hour that behaviour and policy can be changed, that reputations can be salvaged, negative news stories can be turned into positive coverage, the nation's spirits can be lifted. This report has been authored for us by Anna Stewart, who rose through the ranks of the BBC to take charge of BBC Radio 5 Live Drive's programme and steered it to enormous success. Anna departed the BBC last year and agreed to take on this commission for us, speaking to leading figures in PR and broadcast, those that do it and those that broadcast it, so that you can plan better and deliver stronger. I'm thrilled that Anna is here today to chew this over, and we're joined by two others as well who contributed to this report. Luke Stallard is Head of Corporate Communications at Virgin Media O2, whose Daisy campaign was award-winningly successful with considerable broadcast impact. And who couldn't love an AI granny designed to pick up the phone and waste a scam caller's time for as long as she possibly could. And completing our panel today is Callum MacDonald, Times Radio breakfast presenter on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays. Also, many podcasts we were working on here. We're talking about Holyrood sources, Senedd sources, Stormont sources, Whitehall sources. I don't know how you managed to fit it all in, Cam. For those watching this live stream, by the way, if you'd like to ask a question of our guest today, you can do so via our Twitter account at Broadcast Revo, or you can ask a question using the hashtag join the Broadcast Revolution. Of course, the easiest way to do it is actually via the chat on this Zoom link. I'll try and get through as many of those questions as I can. Do please say who you are and where you're from if you possibly can. If you did register to watch with us today, then we'll be sure to email you a link to this broadcast report. It's also available via our own Broadcast Revolution website. Turning to you, Anna, first. What excited you about writing this report?
Well, thank you to you and Broadcast Revolution for setting me, I think, a deliberately ambitious brief, actually. So
it was a bit.
To interview 5 journalists and broadcasters, 5 PR and comms leads, and actually I was really impressed and happy with the lineup and the people that agreed to speak to me. True masters of their craft. I'm not just saying that because 2 of them are sat next to me today. There's so much insight and wisdom in this report, so we'll try and get through some of the key quotes and findings today, but I would encourage everyone to download it and have a good read, because there is just so much wisdom in there. I've gone behind the scenes into newsrooms at Bloomberg, BBC Breakfast, Channel 4 News, 5 Live, a bit more familiar to me, Times Radio in the world of podcasting from Callum, and spoken to comms leaders at Virgin Media O2, Guide Dogs, Matchfit, University of Bath, and a campaigner at the Salons Association. So I was able to hear from both sides, really, and what's really struck me is the similarities between the conversations that people are having in newsrooms are so similar to the ones people are having in offices like this. The jobs are so similar, the challenges are so similar, and when relationships are worked on and nurtured and they work really successfully, there's so many advantages for both parties.
And we talk about the many waves of broadcasting. It's the title of the report. And what you've just emphasised there, really, is so many different platforms exist now. This is not simply a matter of get yourself on the radio and the job is done anymore. And you have to strategise and really think about all of those elements that you want to try and target. Yes, get on the radio, get on the television, get online in some form, get in podcasting in some form, social media in some form. Just develop for us that many waves of broadcasting idea.
Yeah, and actually you'll read in the report, there's when we go into the Bloomberg newsroom, when I speak to Andrew Silk, we'll talk about it later, that was a real eye-opener for me to see exactly how much Bloomberg are doing, and within one brand there are so many different opportunities for PR. As you say, it's not just about can we get on the telly anymore. But in terms of the waves, I mean, we're really looking at 3 waves. which we go into detail in the report, and we use Peppa Pig as an example. So this is, of course, everybody must have seen that Peppa Pig became a big sister last year. And this campaign by Pretty Green and Hasbro, which broadcast Revolution, was so key to landing that initial wave. So this was a broadcast hit on Good Morning Britain.
First wave is broadcast,
yeah.
you're talking about.
Wave 1 is broadcast, the initial hit, and landing that broadcast moment, which was so successful because Richard Arnold on Good Morning Britain interviewed Mummy Pig.
Interrupted by Peppa Pig at one point.
Seen by what? Up to 1 million people, 800,000 people watching that over their breakfast. So that's what we call the initial hit and landing that broadcast moment, which is huge in itself. And as you said, years ago, that would have been job done really, wouldn't it? But now we're looking at the second hit, which is the social surge. And again, all these guys here and everyone in the report are absolute experts at that. How can we get this content and get it on people's feeds, get people sharing, engaging with it, giving them something brilliant to play with? I think we talk about in the report as well. And I think everyone's just so good at that. But what I was really interested in is this third layer, which we're calling in the report the longevity layer or the evergreen content. And in the example of Peppa Pig, so we went from kind of YouTube playlists and social content. The third wave, it became a storyline, didn't it?
Yes.
So we had a gender reveal.
Yes. And of course there was the actual arrival of said piglet. No ham sandwiches were allowed in my house on that particular day. I mean, what I think was fascinating and shocked Good Morning Britain themselves was the millions and millions of tweets and on TikTok as well. It was just a massive hit rate in socials in a way that made that million audience to the initial television broadcast seem comparably small. But without that broadcast moment, that social impact just wouldn't have been there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you get to this kind of third wave, I think that's when you're kind of drawing on that original emotional connection from that initial interview, but you're letting it kind of come back again and again. And I just wanted to mention actually Charlotte Speedy, who is head of comms and influencing at Guide Dogs. She was really interesting on this third wave because it's been a bit of a surprise. They've had something called the Journey of a Guide Dog, which is 2 or 3 years old. Mm-hmm. And Charlotte told me this has come back again and again, and they didn't really know why, but it's been even more kind of interesting and engagement's been even bigger the second time round. It wasn't actually planned for,
yes,
but it's been, and I think for charities, that's an amazing opportunity, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the amazing thing is as well, is there are certain podcasts, if you can land an interview on a certain podcast, people will come back to that, not necessarily the next day, but actually the next week, the next month, the next year. People will keep returning to them. Once they've liked the latest edition of a podcast, they might go back and actually see what's there. The beauty of the curation of the way these things are digested.
Yeah, and I was going to say actually, because I spoke to both Luke and Callum about this third wave, and I know, Luke, it's something you said to me, that's maybe something we might have thought about, we might think a little bit more about that in the future.
What, how to keep it going?
Yeah, the kind of evergreen and making things come back.
Yeah, and I think if you land a really big story in the first instance, I guess that starts to happen naturally, right? So if I think about when we've done it really well, so if when we created Daisy, our AI granny, we got that sort of broadcast hit at the beginning. We got lots of print and online pickup. We then got loads and loads of social, and to your sort of point, it actually blew up bigger on social than it ever did in news views. But then you did end up with this long tail where we had loads of podcasts and people pitching to us saying, hey, can we get somebody on to talk about this? And I think it's exactly that model that you're describing, where it went from, initially you kick off with that broadcast moment, you've got traditional media, you've then got social, and then you've got this long tail and people wanting features and follow-ups and all the rest of it. So yeah, it really does, or did follow that in our case.
And Callum was telling me about the surprise element, that sometimes with your podcast, you get ready for YouTube and all the rest of it, but there's sometimes things that are really surprising to you with that third wave.
Totally. Things just take on a whole new life, I think, and indeed legacy, based on what your core thing is, your core broadcast, your core podcast, whatever it is, none of the clips exist without the 45-minute episode that we've just published, for example. The surprising thing is sometimes you can anticipate if you're feeding into a news story or if you're feeding into something that has already had a bit of buzz online. So if I think about our Holyrood Sources podcast, around this time last year actually, Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, and his deputy, Jackie Bailey, were on the podcast, and he, during that conversation, did a U-turn basically on his view on the gender recognition reform debate, farrago, mess that has been a part of Scottish politics for years. And that's our biggest clip ever. It reached about 1 million people, which was great for us. The other thing though, so that one was probably predictable. It was feeding into a story that already caused a lot of online stir, and it was a great newsline as part of that. The one that caught me by surprise was when Jeff Aberdeen, who I co-host, one of the co-hosts of the podcast with me, he was Alex Salmond's chief of staff when Alex Salmond was First Minister. Jeff just started pontificating one day about Ed Miliband being on manoeuvres, as we say in politics, that he's kind of angling for the leadership. This was a few months ago, by the way. I think Jeff has been proven to probably be about right as the months have gone by. But anyway, this was a few months ago, and Jeff said this, and it went crazy for us. It got tens of thousands of views. And Jeff called me and he said, "Why is that done so well?" And I was literally sitting at my desk looking at it at that exact moment. I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure. And I suppose in hindsight, there's a bit of Ed Miliband's a bit of a main character, he's quite recognisable, maybe it's a bit gossipy, it's quite fun. I don't know if those are the kind of elements of that, but it was great for us and a total surprise.
I think the fun element is something I really want to get across today, and actually there's something about the Peppa Pig story here as well, in that I think some PRs forget this. If you, and you develop this in chapter 3 of the report, that the power of making somebody smile. If you can do that, and I don't think that the Pepper story just embodied that perfectly, but the misery and the mayhem that is in news at the moment, that frankly, if you do create fun, a laugh, some gossip, as you say, it lifts the spirits. And I think that can be so crucial. I mean, you work with Tony Livesey at 5 Live. Tony Livesey has contributed to your report. He's now doing evenings, late nights on 5 Live, and I can't think of a radio presenter who makes me smile more often than Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of his thing. And actually the quote from Tony in this report is that he says controversy is a one-hit wonder, and what he means by that is he's never the type of interviewer that wants a gotcha moment that will get him a newsline. It's always humanity. Humanity is what people remember, and his own award-winning moments have come from, again, nurturing relationships with people who've come back to talk to him again and again. And Chapter 1 is actually all about the DNA of broadcast and really successful broadcast moments. And nearly all the ones I've looked at have something in common, and it is humanity, really.
Yes.
And whether that is Tony Livesey interviewing Dame Deborah James before she sadly dies of cancer, they built that relationship over a number of years, but it can come in like really unexpected ways. Like Peppa Pig, who actually isn't even a human, but there was humanity to that story. Because actually, Tony picks out in the report what happened in that Good Morning Britain studio after that interview with Mummy Pig. The presenters all started talking about families and how you have children and mums and dads where babies come from.
The story became a human one.
It became a human one, even though it's about a cartoon pig. And then Callum was talking, and Aisha Tull, who I spoke to from Channel 4 News. You both referenced the day in February last year when President Zelensky of Ukraine went to the White House to meet Donald Trump, and it went off.
It was huge. This was a Friday night in news when most politicians are at the pub or have, gone home to their constituencies or are doing unspeakable things or whatever. And so most people, as my point is, disengaged from the news a bit more over the weekend. We can see that all in our own routines and lives and stuff. But Zelensky went to the White House, and this was the time that President Trump then, and indeed his vice president, started berating him in the Oval Office. And I can't remember exactly what time it was, Friday, after 7 p.m. anyway, because Jeff Norcott was on Times Radio. I think it was maybe Jeff's second or third week. I might be wrong, but it was certainly early on in him taking over that slot. He's a brilliant broadcaster, extremely funny, really sharp on politics and current affairs as well, which actually was the perfect combination for covering that moment. Times Radio also benefits from sending push notifications when moments like that are happening there, then, live. This is something you might want to, and you just press on it, obviously, and you're connected through to the app to listen live. The app is free to download, by the way, and free to listen to. And so, obviously, there was a push notification. Zelensky's in the Oval Office.
And you can monitor the number of those.
So in the newsroom, I often refer to the tyranny of the worm, but other people are more appreciative of it. Basically, there's a real-time line graph on a massive TV screen on the wall, high up, overseeing all of us in the newsroom. And it registers connected listening, so listening via the internet, on a smart speaker, via the app, on the website, whatever. And there's a straight line across the middle, which is the average of the last, I think it's 12 weeks. And then this line graph moves in real time, up and down, ideally above the average of the last 12 weeks, which indicates growth. And that night, they sent the push notification. The news was obviously happening, and our listening that night was plus 150%. People tuned in for that live moment there and then to hear it happening, and crucially, Anna, I think what you were saying, to hear the analysis of it as well,
yes,
and to hear the discussion around it.
And this is where experts can be plugged into commentating on it, but also what a vote of confidence that is. There can be some that doubt the impact of broadcast because it's not necessarily always hard to measure. But there you are saying, and we see actually in the way it is officially measured, Radio audiences are at record levels. 500,000 people are listening to Times Radio every week. But how amazing for you, embracing live broadcast as well as podcasting in your career, that you see live broadcast go whoosh.
Yeah, and to see it in real time, because as we all, it's so difficult sometimes to get a gauge on how these moments are registering. Obviously that's a technological thing, which is great. Our boss at Times Radio, Big Boss Tim, with whom several of us have worked in the past, would not let me off this panel without saying that over these last 3 weeks, we have beaten the record for connected listening week after week after week. President Trump may be a clown and may be controversial, but he is excellent for ratings because he creates these moments that people want to engage with, learn from, analyse, discuss and be a part of. That's the live thing.
Can you clarify one thing for me? Times Radio has very much moulded over the last 5 years or so into a political network. It is focusing on the politics of, and what a fascinating time to be doing exactly that. How do you make sure there's enough fun? Because we've been talking about Peppa Pig, we've been talking about lightness of touch, and here you're talking about Zelensky being bullied by the most powerful man on the planet. Now that's not going to make me laugh.
No, it's certainly not. I think the fun comes in the people and in the presenters being human, dare I say it. Other radio stations may be slightly more robotic, formulaic, boring, and so Times Radio prides itself on having presenters who don't offer opinions, because I think it's not for me to sit there and say, I think this is the right thing and you should think that too. Rather, it's a more informed conversation about what is happening and what's going on. And I think just by the nature of human conversation, you bring fun with that because you're reflecting and you're analysing. And sure, you might not be laughing about Zelensky being yelled at. You certainly won't be laughing about war and bombing and all the awfulness that's going on in the world. But there are things that are fun and you can laugh at. Peppa Pig or Harry Styles, releasing you can have fun, you can reminisce. And so you create a sort of warmth around the hard news conversation that I think, hopefully, proves to be engaging for people to connect with.
And of course, if one is talking about politics, one is talking about real people and the impact of politicians' decisions on real people's lives.
Yeah.
And you mentioned humanity, and I think that's, again, one of the buzzwords from this report, is you have to be thinking about the human face, and that's how you connect with audiences. And I think that was amazingly captured with the DAISY campaign. Luke, if you can just remind us how the DAISY campaign came together.
Yeah, of course. So, DAISY was ultimately us talking about fraud, right? So, fraud is the UK's biggest crime. I think it's something like 4.5 million instances of fraud last year. So, it's such a big crime that they cut it out and report on it separately to other crime figures. Huge problem. And we had been talking about it for a number of years. We had been getting a lot of reputational heat for it. So, personal finance journalists in particular were coming to us with cases where we hadn't looked after our customers well enough. And there was this sort of sense and perception that when it came to fraud, we were a bit of a weak link in the chain. We wanted to go out and do something about that. So we started building a strategy that would try and address our sort of fraud problem, as it was, and actually make it a strength for us. And so DAISY sort of came a couple of years into us doing this, where we'd been doing lots of things around informing our customers and the public around how they can stay safe, talking more about the improvements we're making, but equally looking structurally at what's needed to try and improve fraud handling, if you like, so that it's not such a problem. I guess Daisy was then this idea that was pitched to us, but I think tapping into the sort of human side of that, like ultimately this was an AI, so a computer talking to somebody, a scammer. There's not really much of a human side to it. But I think there's two things that we did with it that helped make it human and helped make it personable. The first was the sort of choice of talent. So we had Amy Hart, who was a Love Islander that sort of helped front the campaign. But we spent quite a long time debating who was the right talent for this. And shout out to my colleague Erin, who had pushed really hard for it to be Amy. And the reason was that Amy herself had been a victim of scam.
There's the humanity.
Quite right. So she could talk about it from this first person perspective of this happened to me and this is how I felt. And so then you had this authenticity, this honesty, this really personable side that could come through. And I think the second thing that we did with it was that we created this character for Daisy that was this really funny, to your point, and likeable.
She was
woman.
lovable,
Yeah,
wasn't she?
she was great,
this
right?
AI chatbot who looked like my great auntie Mildred.
Yeah, quite. And she had a character and a personality, and you could then relate to her as like, oh, I know somebody like that. And so I think in those ways it started to take what was essentially technology, but make it human and make it personable.
Broadcast was important for you, and
Yeah.
I think one of the complexities, and I think this is one of the problems with AI in general, is sometimes it's hard for a producer and the audience to picture what you're actually talking about. Everyone
Yeah.
talks about artificial intelligence. And yet here, you did have something that could be watched. You could have someone that you could actually watch this granny and see how she was intercepting scam calls and stopping those scam callers phoning my mum in real life. With all of that in mind, how did you focus on getting that broadcast? We supported you in getting that broadcast.
Yeah.
Once you got the broadcast, though, it exploded.
Yeah, so the selling had actually been sort of harder. So we ended up landing a hero slot on, I think it was this morning, which Amy Hart went on and did, but they used a load of the assets, which I think was really important. And I think this is a sort of classic PR problem, that we all go in and we tell our very best story all of the time, but sometimes there's a bit of smoke and mirrors, and we've done this, but have you really done that? And I think seeing is believing, right? Which broadcast helped us do. We had these videos, we had scam calls, where, audio recordings of them. And I think when people could actually see what we were talking about, it was like a penny drop moment of, wow, this is really cool. And in that sense, like once we had that, the story really made sense to people. They're like, okay, I get what you mean when you say there's an AI granny talking to a scammer, because you've shown me the video, I've heard the calls, I get it. So I think it was hard until people had seen that.
Was it Good Morning Britain on ITV, or was it This Morning? I think it was Good Morning Britain, I think it was Good Morning Britain.
I've actually lost track.
But either way, whichever programme it features on, what's fascinating there is you have a comparable audience, around 1 million people watching it, but actually an enormous number of producers, creative talent will watch that and go, I like that. And then suddenly it snowballs.
Yeah, and then suddenly we had, everybody was dropping us messages from BBC to Channel 4 to Channel 5 to Japanese TV, French TV, like it really did blow up. And I think it was, again, they'd seen it, everyone's like, I want a piece of this action, can we come and talk to you? Which was great. It was a very fun and very intense moment.
How important is it, do you think, for PRs watching this? You've got a negative story, you're getting heat, as you say, you're getting criticism. You've leaned into it and actually then presented a lovable, a creative solution. But you had to basically tackle that negative story.
Yeah, and I think there's a degree of being honest with yourselves about what you are doing and if you're ready to tell it. So had we, I think we were in a position where our reputation was quite poor, but actually there was probably quite a lot of work that we were doing under the hood of the business to address that, or that should address the problem. And it was actually a case of storytelling to make sure that landed in public consciousness. Great that we've made improvements to our systems, great that we've got all of these reporting tools for customers, but if nobody knows about it, they still think you're a bit rubbish. And frankly, that's us not doing a good enough job. So we got to a place where we had made a lot of improvements, and then it was worth doing big investment in campaigns to go out and talk about this. If we were still rubbish and things were getting worse, is it the right time? Probably not, because again, seeing is believing, and your customers will be like, great that you've done this, but you've still messed this up for me over here. So I think that there's a degree of honesty that you need to have with yourself around if you're ready to do that. because you can't PR your way out of being rubbish all the time. It just doesn't work, right? Everyone sees through it. Try as we might, but so yeah, that holding yourself to account is important, I think.
How important is another of the buzzwords again in this report is trust.
Yeah.
And broadcast leads the way in trust in a remarkable way, I think, because there you are. You appear on ITV. There's that big broadcast moment. Massive broadcast moments follow. But the social media impact is remarkable at that point, because whichever programme suddenly you are featuring on, in whichever form, whichever guest, whether it's Amy, whether it's a voice from Virgin Media Row 2, whether it's clips from your B-roll of Daisy, you are now going to be going everywhere in social media terms, and that was incredible. Broadcast, though, legitimised your social media, because the interviews were being done by legitimate, by popular, by famous broadcasters.
Yeah.
Those then watching it on social media go, I believe that, I can trust that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think broadcast is important in that. I mean, all traditional media, I think, helps do that as well, right? I mean, we had something like over a billion impressions on social for the campaign, which is way bigger than we're ever going to get out of news. But some of those come from actually the Daily Mail sharing it on their TikTok account. You're suddenly racking up millions of views. Guardian did some long tail; they would be your sort of third wave, really long form. It was video content where they did the calls in a lot more detail. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we were back up to like millions of views again on it, and it's. I think that sort of validation, because there is so much noise on social, but seeing that traditional broadcast and traditional media writing about the story makes people go, okay, yeah, this is actually something worth paying attention to.
Well, I think one of the key things here is yes, sometimes this starts with a big broadcast moment. I get that, but there will also be other campaigns. It won't always be a big broadcast moment, but what we are working on at Broadcast Revolution is making sure that clients such as yourselves, are plugged into, yes, broadcast sometimes, but yes, socials, yes, podcasting. How do you break that down with sort of every one of your campaigns now? Are you really thinking, okay, is broadcast right for us here? Is it going to be socials? Is it going to be podcasting?
Yeah.
We work across them all, but now you are really having to embrace multi-platform in a way that we never did have to before.
Yeah, so I mean, when we're going out with a big campaign, we always try and work out what our media strategy is going to be, and what is the broadcast strategy is always part of that. But I mean, increasingly, I think there's loads of value in it, even for smaller announcements. So, easy example is we're going out with a story this week about mobile improvements we've made in Devon, right? And sure, we can go sell that into our sort of telecoms news, but, my gran in Devon is never going to see that story. So, we're trying to approach local media with it, but actually at the moment we're having an interesting conversation with BBC Devon, who are possibly interested in talking to somebody about it later today. Now, if we pull that off, and hopefully we will, that's great, because actually that's going to tap into a completely different demographic for us, right? It's going to be possibly, there'll be an older cohort of people within that, but there will also be, taxi drivers, there'll be people out doing deliveries, there'll be people in hairdressing salons, there'll be cafes, there'll be this huge range of people that will have that on in the background, and will suddenly have this impression that we wouldn't otherwise get with them, that O2 is improving its network in my local area. For us, from a sort of brand awareness, top of mind perspective, that's really, really useful. So I think it's something that we try and fold in as much as we can. I think it works better for some campaigns than it does for others, right? Like, I think broadcasters, you don't always want to hear from, a fairly flat at times company spokesperson, and you probably have more interesting people to comment, right? So it's around trying to think about what's the pitch for this particular broadcast, and what is it that I actually have to offer in terms of spokespeople or assets that are going to make the story work. But where you can pull it off, it's enormously valuable. It's
interesting you celebrate BBC Radio Devon there, for example, and I go back to, again, one of those buzzwords from the report, trust. And I know, Callum, in your time you have presented on BBC Radio Scotland. Mm-hmm. And I think in broadcast, I encourage anyone in PR to think about the audiences. You're talking about an older audience that you wanted to target with BBC Local Radio.
Well, potentially, but I think it's just a sort of universal audience, right?
Yes.
And a lot of our stories end up in consumer tech, they end up in trade media, like, for a network upgrade story. That's your core media for it. But if we can take that and we can get that out to a mass audience, irrespective of their age, their demographic, any of those things, that's only helpful for us. And a broadcast is a great way of doing it.
Take yourself back to those BBC Radio Scotland programmes you did. I mean, there is a real connection with a passionate, thriving nation in a way that I think some UK-wide stations don't quite manage to do. How important is that relationship with the audience and PR's plugging into that? Because I think if someone's on BBC Radio Scotland, there is a trusting audience listening.
I agree with you, and I think that the sort of crucial part of that is that you're reflecting something more local to people. I always think, so Scotland is a good example of this, but I actually do think it applies more broadly, where when you live there, in some parts of Scotland, you'll be further away from the nearest parliament. You'll be close. So, for example, I'm thinking of the Shetland Islands. You're closer to Norway than you are to Edinburgh, and so you can feel quite distant from that the kind of what would be referred to as the kind of central decision-making political places, for example. Although when you go to Shetland and you tell somebody, as I did, oh, it feels very remote here, they turn around and go, remote from where? And I'm like, yeah, fair, I get that. It's absolutely valid. And so when you've got a radio station or a TV channel that can reflect things that feel closer and make things feel closer to you as a listener or viewer, somebody who's engaging, I think that's vital actually, because those are the things, having better mobile signal in my local area, I find that really important to me. I want to know that. Yeah. If my local hospital is good or bad, I want to know that, because when my mum is ill, I want to know where I should be trying to get her. So I think that is crucial, and I think because you can do that with authenticity at somewhere like a local radio station, or indeed a BBC Radio Scotland in a kind of national context like that, when you can do it authentically, I think that builds on the trust part that you're talking about.
Yes.
Not putting on a show, you are living that same life as the person you are talking to, and therefore you can discuss it authentically.
Shared understanding.
Absolutely, it's essential.
Anna, taking you back to the report and the very beginnings, point 1, chapter 1, humanity, very much so. And you build around it with the iconic story now that BBC Breakfast focused on, and the sub-postmasters scandal. And this, I mean, we were working with Hudgels, the law firm who were representing many of the sub-postmasters, and they let us know there was going to be this ITV1 drama. Toby Young doing his, not Toby Young, it's Toby Young, yes, it's Toby Young, doing his bit. And
Toby Jones.
Toby Jones, that's right. Toby Jones doing his bit and raising the profile of a story that's existed for many years. This was not a new news story.
Not
and yet
a journalist, was it?
A drama gave it a focus, and suddenly that story went everywhere. BBC Breakfast dedicated a significant portion, in addition of its programme, to just get those sub-postmasters in and tell those stories. How important was that when we talk about impact?
It was amazing to meet Caroline Turner, who's the planning producer for BBC Breakfast.
Who you speak to in this report.
And we opened the report behind the scenes of that, actually, because this was before the ITV drama aired, and Toby Jones was on the sofa as a celeb interview, but the audience reaction straight away, before they'd even seen the drama, was enormous. So BBC Breakfast editor Richard Frediani straight away, this is all people are going to talk about for the next few years. And he wanted to hear from the real postmasters. And within 36 hours, 9 of them were on that breakfast television sofa. And to quote Caroline, she was making the calls with the team. It was pushing on an open door.
They were desperate to tell their story.
They had been telling their story, but people were paying attention a bit. There was a BBC podcast, various bits of coverage, but until the audience really saw it on ITV, that's when the doors flew open.
At a BAFTA award-winning level, because Breakfast TV does not tend to win a BAFTA.
No, it's the first time.
This did.
First time Breakfast, any breakfast television has won the Best News Coverage Award. And there are a few reasons for it, I think. I think they're really good on BBC Breakfast at knowing what their audience wants. Caroline herself said they don't care about exclusives because the audience don't care. I had a very similar view on that when I was a BBC radio editor. It's an industry thing, and there'll be different newsrooms who will totally disagree and will want exclusive in news lines. I never did. Richard Frediani at Breakfast doesn't. He just wants stuff that the audience will resonate with and care about. And there was a real editorial bravery to his decision making that morning. He didn't do any other stories. He chucked everything else out and gave these people a voice uninterrupted for nearly an hour. And I think that's what really cut through, and that's what led them to the award.
And Callum, how Times Radio would have run with this story in a big way too. And when we talk about, okay, we need to have humanity in what we're offering to broadcasters, I mean, there was probably no bigger story that had that human face on it. But of course, with Times Radio, there were political ramifications, and this showed how live broadcast, an ITV drama, then live broadcast, again, another wave of broadcasting that we sometimes don't even anticipate. The drama gets people talking, broadcasters pick that up. But you were able to focus on the political ramifications and the enormous change. This was the biggest miscarriage of justice, arguably, in the UK ever.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on that, you hear the humanity from the sub-postmasters, but then there is an accountability part as well that people want to then engage with. And I suppose that is probably Times Radio's kind of bread and butter, is to take on the politicians on these sorts of things, or indeed others who may have been responsible for such gross injustice as that. I think when it comes to that particular story, one of the key things about it is how talkable it is. It's the dramas do this anyway, but when it's based on real life, you want to talk about it with your colleagues and your friends and your family, and you want to say, did you see that drama about the post office? Oh my goodness. And then you can say, well, I heard the minister on the radio this morning getting a hard time and he couldn't answer any of it. And I heard Ed Davey having to answer for his time when he was responsible for this. And I heard James Arbuthnot, one of the MPs at the time, who had been trying to make some progress on behalf of his constituent, who was a sub-postmaster, and by default all the other sub-postmasters as well. I heard James Arbuthnot on the telly, or saw him on the TV this morning, and he was saying this hasn't moved on. It hasn't, and so it becomes a very talkable thing. I think drama's very good for that. I do think broadcast and the breakfast effort with the sub-postmasters does the same thing. Did you see them all? Did you see all those people this morning saying that thing? And more than that, if I can just bring it back to the social media side of this, it's shareable.
Yes.
It's the sort of thing you then share with your friend, and you press the share button on the Instagram reel, or you press the retweet button and you add your own take. This is awful. I can't believe this has happened. And so it becomes a shareable thing as well.
And then into your third wave, which is the updates
Right.
and the progress
You
reports.
check in.
These people still haven't had their compensation, still haven't had their money. And I think for newsrooms that are getting smaller in terms of their staff, I think the best PR and comms people are just coming back and saying, do you remember this guest? Do you remember this story? Do you remember this? There's a little update. We're now doing this. And that's an absolute gift for, producers who
Definitely.
don't have as much time anymore. And kind of, because you're doing like 5 days a week often, and I was on drive 3 hours a day.
Yes.
You forget, and I was always trying to get the producers, keep notes, that was an amazing guest, go back to them. But everyone's so overwhelmed and the news cycle's so overwhelming. So if you're like a clever PR person, I just think stay in touch with that producer and say, do you remember this amazing expert who is a bit of an insomniac and will stay up until midnight to talk with Tony Livesey, or will get up at 5 a.m. to be on air for 6 for Callum. Those offers are such a gift. They really are.
I think that's surprising, because I think we often feel like we need to come up with something fresh.
Interesting.
Because it's like, you need the news to move on to get the opportunity to go back in again. And I mean, we've actually seen some of that recently where, talking about Daisy as part of a wider fraud strategy, one of the things we've been pushing for is reform of how the police tackle fraud, because at the moment it's a sort of patchwork of local forces that investigate, and inevitably, my local police force in, Bedfordshire or wherever, isn't well equipped to tackle a crime which is probably perpetrated internationally with a fake address from Manchester and a phone that gets delivered to Cornwall and then moves around in between. And so we've been trying to call for greater centralisation, and that is now what the Home Office has recently announced in terms of the policing white paper they announced earlier this week. And we've been using that to try and jump in off the back of it. But I think the idea that we almost just keep on checking in, being like, hey, we've still got that spokesperson and we're still banging on about this, is something that to me feels like it's not really going to be enough, but maybe we should be trying it more.
I think so, and it depends on the editor and the producer. And again, this is often, I think I share a similar kind of DNA to what BBC Breakfast are doing. They love nurturing those relationships and going back. And Caroline from BBC Breakfast, that day I spoke to, was checking in with the postmasters just to say, hello, how are you? We haven't forgotten about you. Because I think news is very, very guilty of going all in on people and then just forgetting they exist. And I think a lot of people who contribute to news programmes would say that happens a lot.
What's fascinating is you would talk about this multi-platform approach, so many different facets of it, but actually secure that broadcast moment, and actually you are accessing your own longevity layer of a sort, because actually what you're saying about please stay in touch, and the fact that that planning editor, that Caroline was doing that, was actually reaching out many months after the first contacts have been made, it just goes to show you have to stay in touch with those broadcasters and breed a relationship of trust. I know Guide Dogs talked to you about this, and again BBC Breakfast, that there are those with visual impairments within BBC staff, and actually often an outlet for them to tell their stories is BBC Breakfast. But BBC Breakfast's continuing relationship with Guide Dogs, it's building on trust, it's building on those great interviews you've had before, and it just keeps snowballing.
Yeah, to the point where actually the chapter when we speak about Daisy, and there's a whole chapter about broadcasts that creates change in different ways, and Guide Dogs and BBC Breakfast, one of the things that was most successful for getting more volunteers for Guide Dogs, that happened not by accident, but just so organically, because the programme had a relationship with Sean Dilley, who needed a new guide dog, and obviously the audience were really
the BBC
familiar.
reporting team.
Yeah, sorry, the correspondent who was appearing on Breakfast regularly. So the audience knew Sean and they knew Sammy the guide dog. And so it wasn't a campaign. I don't think it happened intentionally, but it grew from there because BBC Breakfast already had that great relationship with guide dogs. The audience had the relationship with the correspondent and the guide dog. So they did VTs, they did accountability type stuff, and why, this is how you train a guide dog, and dedicated so much time to it, because I think they're really good at that, to the point where they saw a massive increase in volunteers, and that happened organically, but from a relationship that had worked quite well up to that point.
Let's take a couple of questions. Thanks very much for the questions coming in. Imran from Deloitte, a couple of questions here. How big does an initial broadcast hit for Wave 1 need to be? Does it have to be TV? Can it be radio? Can it be a podcast? Is there anything that's more effective, I suppose?
Well,
It can be radio, first of all.
Yeah,
of course.
absolutely.
Partly, and I will say partly because, and I don't think I'm breaching any confidences here, but so for Times Radio, we are about to start live streaming full time on YouTube. Already, we clip everything in the known universe and put it on YouTube and on social media as well. So a radio station is not just, you're not just listening to it, and it's not been, so you're still getting visual moments out of it. And like our Times Radio channel's grown to over 1 million subscribers, and the Times channel's over 1 million subscribers. So these are big audiences that are in addition to those who are listening on the radio. So I will just toot the horn for yes, it can absolutely be on the radio where you want to create your first wave.
Yeah, and someone who worked in radio for 20 years, I'd also say the same. Yeah.
Well, certainly one truism is radio essentially now is a visual medium.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it is feeding into a question from Jack from Deloitte, talking about Wave 2, where we talk about social media impact or whatever. Any examples of landing content successfully? Perhaps you can kind of, away from Daisy, where something has struck a chord on socials. Because actually, with VMO2, you are linking up with responsible stuff like getting people good mobile phone signal, but also around ticketing, for example, all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, the secondary ticketing was a big one for us. But I mean, I think the thing that actually comes to mind, and because it wasn't like we had tons and tons of broadcast TV when we kicked it off, was we did a campaign a few years ago, which was essentially it was us running a competition for primary schools where they could win the opportunity to have their school nativity play put on Virgin TV and accessible to millions of people at Christmas. And it was all designed to just raise awareness of the TV platform and go out and do this feel-good thing, tap into that emotional connection, very human-led around Christmas time. And when we went out with that, it was my colleague Simon that worked on it with me, but he and his idea, his campaign was fantastic. But we had Stephen Mulhern that went out and sort of fronted it up, and he's obviously fantastic talent to work with. But again, we had him on a morning sofa slot. He went out and spoke about this competition, how exciting it was for these schools. And then we had loads and loads of schools that were sharing this on social media, teachers that were sharing it on their accounts. And it kicked off a lot of conversation within a particular community. Now, was it trending on Twitter? No, of course not. But was it actually reaching those people that we needed it to? And they shared it among their networks, which is actually what drove loads of schools to enter. Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, that was a great TV opportunity, and we did have, ITV primetime on it, but it was just like one TV thing alongside some regional radio. Shout out to the radio.
Yeah, that really does tie in with Kaz Nichols from Match Fit, who you worked with when she was at the England
Wales Cricket Board. Yes.
Yeah, and she was really good on authenticity. So working with her athletes to find out what they were interested in, which you guys at Broadcast Revolution then landed Ollie Pope on a dog walking podcast, and she actually says, right, the C-suite or the bosses might not have heard of this, but it really resonated with a certain type of audience, specific audience, which is really important. And I think what came across from the comms and PRs people I spoke to, because Charlotte Guide Dog said the same thing, it feels less about maybe impressing the bosses or how many pieces of media did this get. That's often important. But sometimes it's about reaching the audience you want to reach, and you can do that in so many different ways.
And thinking outside the box. I mean, we talk about all these platforms and whatever. I was not expecting necessarily a test match cricketer to be appearing talking about his pooch. But how wonderful. And suddenly you're opening up that messaging from the ECB in this case to a totally different audience. And a podcast audience, king of the podcast over here, Mr. does one every day of the week. But the amazing thing with podcasts is you get a lot of data from it. You can monitor quite closely how many are listening, how long for, are they getting to the end? And that is very valuable data.
Really valuable. Some of our podcasts have a completion rate of 105%, I saw the other day.
You mean someone listens again?
They're listening again,
right,
basically.
okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, which is really nice. It's really, really good. And I think there's a lot in podcasting, I think, that from the report that connects to the report as well. And the idea of waves actually is kind of encompassed in all of it. There is obviously a difficulty sometimes in the sorts of podcasts we're making, which are very newsy, that you're worried that they're going to kind of go out of date too quickly. Several journalists here who you feel that anxiety when something great has happened on the podcast. We must publish this really, really soon. But actually, people listen to it so differently and at different times. So we always are very careful to make sure that on the podcast we say, and we're recording on Thursday, the whatever date it is, because somebody will be listening to it next week. Somebody will be listening to it in 6 months' time. So the kind of podcasting bit of it, I think, is in terms of kind of creating those waves, is you can have a moment. You might have to sit on that moment for 24 hours while you turn the thing around, because you want it then to have the full kind of range of impact, as discussed in the waves, with social media, with visualization, with YouTube. The data, I mean, it can be a tyrant at times, but it is incredibly helpful when you're looking, for example, for sponsorship, and to offer the opportunity to people. You can see exactly where people are listening from. You can see exactly how long they're listening for, gender split, demographics, because everyone has to sign up to a Spotify account or an Apple Podcast account or whatever. And you can monitor in real time what people like and what people don't. I've been quite surprised in the last, so we've really focused on, primarily due to resources, the last kind of year is when we focused on YouTube particularly. And whenever, on any of the podcasts, whenever we do an episode focusing on a poll, an opinion poll, the numbers go through the roof. And I don't know, politics nerds on YouTube like looking at graphs. I'm not sure what that distills down to.
So having some research, having a poll to build around can be an enormous boost.
Absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. It's really, really demonstrable and noticeable.
Is that because basically somebody like Luke can then offer a distinct top line? Here is something brand new that we have asked, and people are telling us this.
Yeah, I think there is something unique about it for sure. I think also those are the conversations that get quite nerdy, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I think that is in my world of these podcasts, that is what people are looking for. They are politics nerds in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in England, who are really wanting to drill into something. When you've got actual data, i.e. from a poll, people just are all about that. We also see surges around big news events. People are kind of looking around for something that might take a bit more time and slower pace to analyse things. So in Scotland, that was when Humza Yousaf resigned, for example. Yeah, not a huge fan of the podcast, I don't think, Humza, although his team all were. I mean, arguably, if he'd listened to the podcast more, he'd probably still be First Minister, but anyway, we shan't get into that. So around big news moments, people are looking for the place that there is space for the conversation. And actually on Trust Mike, there's a bit of research, I think it's from Acast, I don't think I'm misattributing, that says that podcast hosts are third most trusted to listeners after family and friends. Podcast hosts then rank really highly, and when you join the dots of that, it makes total sense. You're listening to the same people every week. they're right here, they're in your brain. There's a real connection there.
Well, does that perhaps explain why, if you look at the Today programme presenters on Radio 4, for example, only one of them at the moment doesn't have their own podcast. They are all tapping into that podcast sphere. And interestingly, Amal Rajan is about to depart the Today programme, but he will continue to present his Radical podcast. He is seeing the importance of that podcast, and that's why we are working so hard to try and plug into those podcasts.
Yeah, I think it is that. I think you can see what works. You have time and space to do it yourself. You're not rushing to get to the next ad break or news bulletin or whatever it is. We always say we aim for about 40 to 45 minutes per episode, but if a conversation is carrying on, there's nothing to constrain that. You can keep going, and I think that is very attractive to broadcasters, and indeed should be attractive to guests as well.
I think.
Can I just
go
jump in for a second? Do you see a world in which you start sharing more of that data publicly? Because I think from a PR perspective, we'll have limited amount of interview time that we can offer up, and then we're trying to balance out what's going to be the best bang for our buck, right? And I've got time with whoever it is. And there might be a podcast opportunity, but it often feels like a little bit of a black box.
Yep.
Like, who listens to it? How many people? I don't know.
Yeah.
Versus, cool, I know broadly how many people are going to be, watching ITV or whatever at a particular time. So do you see a world in which more of that starts to get shared with the PR industry?
Yeah, I'm glad you've asked. I can add you to our mailing list, because just at the end of last year, we put out exactly that, two potential people who may be interested, one in having guests on the pod, potentially sponsoring the podcast to get their message heard by these really engaged audiences that we have. So yes, I mean, we share very publicly our sort of top line numbers for anyone to see. But we have an actual pack that has it all in there for the likes of you, so that you can see properly what it is you're kind of signing up for, because I think is really important. It can often feel a bit murky. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's so competitive, and so nobody wants to be the one that puts their head above the parapet and says, well, 20,000 people listen every week, and then they get blown out of the water by somebody else.
And there's a lot of celebs moving into this space, and everybody wants to protect their own brand.
Yeah, for sure.
I've got the biggest podcast or whatever.
Yeah, totally. We can't all be Alistair Campbell.
I think you've answered this up to a point, Callum, but I'm keen that we just develop a further answer for Richard from UK Research and Innovation. Do you think that the Today programme sets the daily agenda? I know you work for Times Radio. Actually, I want to kind of pivot slightly and develop Richard's point. There are many radio stations to listen to, and Times Radio's, that 500,000 audience is a significant one. A lot of those were former Radio 4 listeners.
Yeah.
A lot of them are former Radio 5 Live listeners. What I want to add to Richard's point is, when will podcasting, or are we already there, when will podcasting be setting the agenda in the way the Today programme, Times Radio 5 Live Breakfast does?
So I think it is extremely competitive for setting the agenda, the news agenda. I think the Today programme used to have a monopoly on that. I genuinely, I know I would say this, but I genuinely don't think they still do. And I think that is because of the multi-platform nature of what's happening. So where the sort of 500,000 or 600,000 live listeners to Times Radio is smaller than the Today programme's audience, that doesn't stop the cut through being huge. Let me give you an example from the general election last year. I was in Grimsby, because there was a debate happening that it was the Sky News interviews with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But that morning on breakfast, Asma Mir was interviewing Grant Shapps. Now, Grant Shapps was out on the round. He was doing all the interviews on all the outlets, including on the Today programme and elsewhere. And it was that morning that Grant Shapps said, vote Conservative to stop a Labour supermajority. And he used the word supermajority. And that led to the BBC's 6 o'clock news. And I was speaking to Chris Mason, the political editor of the BBC in Grimsby, about that, and he was like, Times Radio's won the day today. And so the Today programme was left in the dust. Not for the first time, not for the last. And so it was Times Radio that set the agenda. So I think the competition is a lot harder now.
And how fascinating that essentially there's Times Radio then being quoted on the BBC.
Yeah.
Broadcast feeds off itself. I know you've had occasions where even one of your more bespoke podcasts focusing on Holyrood or whatever, that's then hit mainstream broadcast, as it were, and that's quoted. Now it's about plugging into the various elements, because you never know where one will then feed the other.
Yeah, that's right. So I think with the podcast, it's been really fascinating actually as a thing over the last couple of years. So I think all of our podcasts now have set the news agenda on various occasions. Most recently, the Stormont Sources podcast in Northern Ireland led the front page of the Daily Mirror in Northern Ireland after an interview with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn. The Senedd Sources podcast in Wales was actually quoted in a Senedd debate just last week, and the week before that, I think I'm getting it right, it had led the BBC Wales News website. I've not said that very well, but the Wales section of the BBC News website, it was from an interview with the First Minister of Wales. That was leading that section. The Holyrood Sources podcast has been the basis of so many interviews on the BBC, I've lost count. So all of them feed into the news agenda, and I think it's because journalists they're on the hunt for news. I don't think anybody is overly precious about where it comes from, which I think is a good thing, because the news is the news, and so if somebody said something interesting over there, go for it.
How fascinating that the waves of social media, the waves of podcasting, the waves of online hits then starts feeding further into broadcasting, and the whole thing snowballs. A final question coming through to us before I start heading towards wrapping things up, guys, because time is flying by. Owen asks, if you don't get coverage in morning broadcasts, have you missed the wave? I'll ask that to a drive time editor.
It was a huge frustration as a drive time editor that all the stuff was going to the, if there's a big rollout of an amazing story, we didn't get a look in, and the BBC did try to change that a little bit with a new kind of team they set up to place their journalism and get big impact, but it just doesn't work. It is the breakfast outlets who are still king in that area.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it sets the day in motion. What I always loved, and I used to work with Anna on Drive as a producer, and she's the best editor I've ever worked with. As the day goes on, you got the chance to do something different on what so somebody says X on breakfast, and then through the day, and in our day at Five Live was extremely good at this, at building the momentum through the day and doing a different angle on it. And so by the time you got to Drive, you suddenly had to be
a bit creative,
That's
shall
right.
we say?
Yeah,
There were creative opportunities
What's the
to
alternative
redo
way?
the same story.
Exactly that. How's it moved, and how can we cover it? It was always quite fun.
But I guess maybe the PR take on it though as well is, if the story is breaking, you are looking for a different angle come the afternoon, right? So then what's the opportunity to put your stamp on that story? Because you need a new voice, you need a fresh angle, but the agenda has already been set.
Yeah.
And if I could on that, and I would say this, but when guests are being offered, I would always say, don't be afraid of committing news. And I think that when you've got an opportunity to say something, say it. I think sometimes that you can almost feel a reticence for somebody to go just that half step further, because they're worried that suddenly that'll generate buzz. But actually, I mean, and obviously it has to align with priorities and what your campaign is and all of that. But actually, it's so refreshing when you hear from somebody who's a big guest who can create those waves and start that thing, or react to something that's happened in the daytime.
Well, it's boring if somebody sits on the fence, right?
Yeah.
You want somebody to come on and have an opinion.
Yeah.
Very briefly, what did change, thankfully, in my 20 years at Five Live, there used to be this assumption that the audience had listened to every single piece of output on Five Live that day. So but we did that on breakfast, and it may have run for 2 minutes, or So I think newsrooms have got much better at replaying content. You heard this morning. Let's get more. I think the story about the Salt Path, which the Observer had, that is the absolute masterclass on how you take one story and you just keep going with it and you just keep pushing with it.
And the University of Bath contributed to your report as well, where they are plugging in their experts, media trained, savvy experts, often first at the local level, then at the national level as they get used to broadcast exposure. But if a story is there, Owen, on breakfast, experts can be injected, whether it's from a brand such as VMO2, to carry on the story, give a perspective on it. This is how our newsroom model works at Broadcast Revolution, trying to plug people in. But the University of Bath really finds that plugging in their academics, whether it's in a story that they have written up and it's their story, or whether it's just the story of the day and they're commenting on it, really valuable.
Yeah, there's sometimes a bit of timing to that, and I think that's why working with Broadcast Revolution has been amazing for the University of Bath. There was a story that Tony Rodden there told me about. They had an academic who was talking about negative interest rates, which only the real experts cared about. But then Donald Trump started talking about negative interest rates. They had an academic ready to go. She ended up talking to the World Bank and, off the back of this story that you guys plugged her in properly, and off it went from there. So there's a bit of timing, there's a bit of knowledge, isn't there? It's just knowing, sometimes, again, jumping on the wave of when this story is going to break and who have we got who can help explain it. And
addressing Owen's point around, is it breakfast the be-all or end-all? You spoke to Andy Silk at Bloomberg, And he highlights in your chapter 3 that there are many live TV shows, terminals, podcasts, newsletters, TikTok, YouTube, live Q&As, long read explainers, now a weekend programme presented by a former Today presenter, Michelle Hussein. It is a podcast. It shows that this is a 24/7 operation.
And a very intentional strategy. They've brought in Michelle so they can now lean into arts and culture and a different audience that's not just the bread and butter Bloomberg audience, which might be politics and finance. They're purposely doing that 7 days a week. They're getting their subscribers in, and once they're there, they've got to keep them. So the offer's enormous. It's a massive ecosystem to plug. I felt exhausted just listening to Andy explain all the things they're doing, honestly. So as PR and comms, again, it's like, okay, so we haven't got into their live TV thing, but could we get on one of their newsletters, or they're doing all these new formats, live Q&As, could we get a guest on one of them?
Just
so even
for
within
PRs,
one brand.
just look what there is, and
Yeah.
Bloomberg doing exceptionally well at
And
that.
they're watching their audience exactly, they're monitoring them. So they've doing the homework on their audience, they know what they want. So if the PRs are doing the homework on the brand and all the outlets they can feed into, that's a
And
very
a quick
good
word
thing
from
to do.
somebody who presents on Saturdays and Sundays, don't forget the weekend.
Yeah.
You need stuff, you need content.
100%. And even in the last couple of weeks, actually, the news agenda has been peaking at weekends. Andy Burnham was one example, Greenland another example, and that's just literally in the last 2 weeks, isn't it, I think? So no, absolutely. I often think the kind of political week runs like Sunday to Thursday. And so actually Sunday feels, for us, like when we're kind of revving our engines to get back into the week again. Saturday's probably a bit more chilled, but I mean, notwithstanding things I've just mentioned. The weekends are a really important time, because I think while it might feel like a more leisurely listen, people have more time on their hands to listen for longer, is the other part of it. Because you're kind of having an easier start to the day before you take the kids to football practice or whatever it is, you've got an easier and longer time to engage with what it is we're doing. And I think
BBC
that's
News
really
Online
nice.
strategy now, digital strategy, is to win the weekend.
Is it really?
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So weekends, do not forget the weekends. I do want to wrap up with a reference point to another contributor to your report, Toby Dicker, co-founder of the Salon Employers Association, a man who at one point emotion almost got the better of him. He was crying on Sky News talking about the impact of national insurance contributions for small businesses and the people he was going to have to let go. The definition of a human story, a case study, plugging into the politics. The clip that Sky News would most definitely, I'm not saying one has to be emotional in every single broadcast, but Sky News would have made the most of that social media opportunity and said, here is a human being who is going to have to let people go. There's your social media. And wow, Toby went everywhere in the world of podcasts and broadcast after that.
He knew his facts and figures as well. He's an amazing guy. I have so much respect for him, and he would say himself his job isn't done, but the impact of that one interview is too long for me to tell you now, but it's all in the report. And as he'd say himself, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, knows his name now. So that all came off the back of that moment.
I'd say, almost pulling this together, that it used to be when we talked about broadcast, it was all about coverage. And now, because of what can be clipped and used in social media, because of what can get onto podcasts, the word should be impact. What impact can you deliver through broadcast, through socials, through the podcast? But impact needs to be at the forefront of any PR's mind.
Yeah.
Would you concur with that? Particularly with Daisy, you got impact there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big learnings that I took away from the campaign is that we PRs can still think too narrowly just about getting coverage. But I think a lot of the audience, a lot of the opportunity might exist in social, it might exist in that longer tail, your wave 3. It might be podcasts, it might be new formats. And while we often think in that way, I don't think we truly think in that way and live it and breathe it. And the more we can do that, the more impactful we're going to be.
And I genuinely think there is gratitude from people like Callum who are working within a commercial radio environment where they're not necessarily every resource that you might have had at the BBC.
Yep, that's true.
And the BBC's resources have been pared back. You saw
Very much so.
the impact of that. If somebody like you presents a fantastic campaign with all of the assets, all of the components that we're talking about, where a producer can see a great broadcast moment, social media traction, that can follow through on a podcast. Presenters surely are more grateful than ever before for great, well thought through, strategized public relations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
make a producer's job easier. I think. And yeah,
Shall we be changing the name of the podcast of the report?
Caroline Turner at Breakfast Telly, she said one of the most amazing things they've done with Sir Alex Ferguson on dementia, that came from his name was buried in paragraph 4 of a press release. Luckily someone spotted it, rang them up, will he say this on telly? He would. I think, Callum, you talk about being really specific with an offer as far as PRs can. I know it's not always so easy now. I've spoken to Tony at the University of Bath, but I think in the report you just talk about being really specific.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. People are up against it. It doesn't need to be an essay. Bullet points are welcome. Short. Who's the guest? What is the line? What are they going to say? Crucially, that idea of are they going to say something that feels valuable? Yeah, specificity is great. Also, sometimes really basic things like contact details are left off. That sort of initial approach. It's like when you're up against it trying to turn something around, you want to be able to pick up the phone, dial it, get someone, get an answer, lock it in. So yeah, specificity I think is really, really good. Just don't be brief, that's fine. It's not rude, I think is the crucial thing.
I hope we've analysed for you the DNA of those great broadcast moments, but frankly, it's so much more than broadcast. Broadcast can be the start, it could be the middle, it could be the end. But socials, podcasting, it's all woven in. It's been fascinating hearing from Callum, from Luke, from Anna. Thank you, all three of you, for that. My thanks for being with us today. If you registered and are watching this event live, we'll be emailing you a copy of the report that we've been talking about today. You can always head for the Broadcast Revolution website to get a copy there too. Until our next Broadcast Revolution event, thank you so much for watching.